Jesus and Muhammad, Matters of the Heart, is an article I placed on an academic website early in 2020 that received so many more downloads that a colleague recommended putting it on a public website so as to make the astounding information contained within it available to the public at large. Jesus and Muhammad, the central figures of the world's two great monotheistic religions, are joined by an extraordinary, almost unbelievable coincidence having to do with the aorta and left ventricle of the heart. Who would have imagined that in so small an area of the human body, such a personal connection could be found? It's so atypical that of all the many other possible instances where some similarity might exist, it makes the odds of it occurring appear as something beyond computation. In each instance, the aorta in Muhammad's case and the left ventricle for Jesus play astoundingly noteworthy parts in offering powerful testimony about the truth or falsity of claims made by the religions that center about them. Let's see how this happens. The aorta is the largest artery in the human body and is connected to the left ventricle of the heart, the thickest of the heart's chambers and the one responsible for pumping oxygenated blood throughout most of the system. It is the life force of the body. If it ceases to function, or if the aorta is severed, then that will bring about the death of the individual. The first mention of Muhammad's heart, specifically his aorta, playing any significant role in his claims of being a divinely appointed prophet, is found in Islam's preeminent holy book, the Quran, Surah 69, verses 44 through 46, where it is stated that Allah will have Muhammad's aorta severed, therefore bringing about his death, if any of his claims are false and not truly from God. Now, while often begged by his disciples to offer miraculous signs, as Jesus is reported to have done, as evidence that he was truly elected to the prophetic office he claimed for himself, Muhammad resisted in doing so on the grounds that he was not sent to work wonders or miracles, but to reveal the Quran. So while there's no miraculous affirmative attestation within the text as evidence of his being a true prophet of God, no report that he cured the blind, the deaf, the lame, or lepers from any afflictions, there is this one clear negative indicator of what God will bring about, of what will happen to Muhammad if he were in fact a false prophet. He would have his aorta severed. Over a century after Muhammad's death, several Muslim scholars began collecting stories and vignettes about the life of Muhammad and his early followers. These were needed as supplementary information that believers could employ in how to live out the commands of the Quran, as this text was sparing in clear descriptions or examples that would aid believers in applying its otherwise ambiguous or vague prescriptions in their moral and religious lives. These became known as hadiths, the Arabic word for news, and the most renowned of these in the Muslim tradition are the hadiths of Bukhari, collected about 130 years after Muhammad's death. In it, Bukhari reports that Muhammad died by being poisoned from a sheep dish prepared by a woman of the tribe of the Bani Nadir, which he had defeated in the Battle of the Khaybar Oasis. She did this to avenge the deaths of her family members suffered in the attack. Muhammad's reaction to the poison was quickly seen by his retinue. In fact, one of them, who ate more than he did or more quickly, died virtually on the spot. But Muhammad tried to calm them by saying that Allah would not allow this woman to succeed in killing him. On this point, his supposed prophetic powers didn't do so well. Now, as a Christian, I fully agree with Muslims that God often accomplishes what he wills through human agencies. The Jewish and Christian scriptures are full of such examples. But I do not share their belief that the Koran is a genuine divine revelation. Accordingly, I will not use this text to prove that Muhammad was a false prophet. For Muslims, however, they do not have a non-Muslim's option in the matter as long as they remain believers. For them, the revealed word of the Almighty, omniscient, and infallible Allah has clearly indicated in their most sacred book what kind of death Muhammad would suffer were he in fact the false prophet, or one who had added spurious passages not given to him from on high. Now, as already noted, Muhammad's prediction that Allah would protect him was to prove false sometimes later when he fatally succumbed to the woman's plot. He is further quoted by Bukhari as to the conditions that brought about his death. O Aisha, Aisha was his favorite wife, who he married when he was in old age and she was a 6-year-old. O Aisha, I still feel the pain caused by the food I ate at Khaybar, and at this time I feel as if my aorta is being cut by this poison. I feel as if my aorta is being cut by this poison. Now, Muslim apologists are going to be quick to respond that the Prophet's description here should be taken figuratively, as a way of his saying that he was experiencing severe pain. One can easily understand why they would go to such lengths in order to reduce the impact that description would have if taken literally on the genuineness of Muhammad's prophethood. But does that really take into account the highly specific way that Muhammad is describing his agony? That his aorta is being severed? Surely, if there are any verses that he would most likely remember and call to mind instantly, it was those that had to do with him directly, especially as they might relate to his death. There aren't that many statements in the Koran about Muhammad himself. Why then does he use such a specific metaphorical description of the pain he is feeling that squares so fully with the literal one supposedly revealed for how he would die if his prophetic utterances were false? That's quite a dilemma for any true believer to ponder. Namely, that if they follow the logic of the claims in their most sacred texts, the Koran and the Hadiths, it requires them to put into serious doubt Muhammad's claims about being a true prophet of God. I want to express my appreciation for the research David Wood has done on this topic. Some of the material in his Acts 17 apologetic sites were used in putting together this video. It is highly recommended for a more in-depth treatment of the Muslim religious literature and their theological ramifications. Now, what about Jesus? In what way does the left ventricle of the heart relate to the claims made by or about him in the Scriptures as to the role he plays in the redemption and sanctification of humanity? Well, less than a century after Muhammad's death, an event occurred in the early 8th century near the Italian city of Lanciano that, while not the first of some 150 similar recorded instances spread throughout the centuries, right down into modern times and throughout the world, the Eucharistic miracles of the host and wine used in communion actually becoming true flesh and blood, it is unique insofar as it is the first where the transformed host and wine into flesh and blood is still present to this very day and is on public display in a reliquary above the tabernacle of the main altar and has been made available for scientific study by the Church, and that on several occasions. In the case of Lanciano, The transformation of the host and wine into flesh and blood was immediate, just as the priest uttered the words of consecration. Others have taken a day or more for them to occur. Many of these have been forensically examined by competent medical professionals, and the results boggle the mind and confuse science. The blood is real human blood, type AB positive. This is the same in all cases that have been tested, as well as on the Shroud of Turin. AB positive blood is the third rarest, 3% of the world's population, with only AB negative 1% and B negative 2% being rarer. AB positive is most frequently found among persons living in the Near East and is the only universal donor type for plasma among the 7 other blood types. So there's a certain fittingness that this should be Jesus' own blood classification. The many samples examined revealed the same proportion of proteins as are found in blood that only recently came from a human body. They even contain white blood cells, which usually die within minutes of a blood flow loss, and some of these samples examined are centuries old. Blood removed from the body in any way will congeal and become useless within hours if not refrigerated, dissolving and corrupting within a short time thereafter. Yet the blood from the Lanciano miracle over 1,300 years ago to those occurring in the 20th and 21st century, while most, if not all, have coagulated, like the Lanciano sample, still possess the characteristic of blood that would have come from a live body. In 1970, Dr. Orlando Linoli and Dr. Ruggero Bertelli, both renowned specialists in their fields, performed a strict scientific examination of the samples from the reliquary at Lanciano and concluded that the blood of this Eucharistic miracle contained the usual range of minerals, chlorides, phosphorus, magnesium, etc., and that the proteins in it, quote, in the clotted blood were found to be normally fractionated, with the same percentage ratio as those found in normal, fresh blood. Professor Bertelli further noted that the blood, had it been taken from a cadaver, would have altered rapidly through spoilage and decay. All of the samples examined indicated high levels of bilirubin, as is on the Shroud of Turin, indicative of the fact that the person whose blood this was had been subjected to intense physical trauma. The fact that all the examined instances are AB positive in type and display these characteristics, that they come from many areas in the globe and are separated from centuries from one another, make coincidence a virtual statistic impossibility. Even more amazing were the results of the DNA test done on the Lanciano sample, 8th century, with that of a similar occurrence in Buenos Aires in 1996, forensically examined in 1999 by cardiologist Dr. Frederick Zugiba, that clearly showed that the blood and heart muscle flesh came from the same man. The fact that the heart muscle and the blood have not deteriorated, though exposed to the atmosphere and to the common biological laws by which such human parts naturally corrupt, remain a phenomenon that science cannot explain, nor does it seem would ever be able to do so. It's not surprising that at least one of the medical experts who examined the blood and muscle tissue of one of these Eucharistic miracles, when informed of the circumstances surrounding the samples that he had finished investigating, did a 180-degree turnabout from being an avowed atheist to a confirmed believer. There is another Eucharistic miracle which occurred in Siena, Italy some 290 years ago, but which is unique in its own right. During a festival, thieves broke into the sacristy of the Church of St. Francis and stole a ciborium containing hundreds of consecrated hosts. Several days later, these hosts were discovered in a donation box of another church. Because they were no longer pure, mixed with dust and cobwebs, they were returned to the ciborium and placed in the tabernacle, with the expectation that they would eventually deteriorate and then placed in water where they would dissolve and then be poured into the ground. But as the years and decades passed, to the amazement of all who examined them from time to time, no signs of changes of any sorts were visible. It was decided to put other unconsecrated hosts in a separate ciborium in the same tabernacle and observe if these would remain in an unchanged state as well. Not so. They naturally decayed with time, as one would expect. The other preserved hosts were microscopically examined and found to be as fresh as the day they were made. These hosts can still be seen in the Basilica of St. Francis in Siena, Italy. So too can many of the examples of the blood and flesh of the other Eucharistic miracles that are on displays in reliquaries in the churches where these events happened. What lessons are we to draw from these occurrences? What inferences should a rational mind most directly make? Well, the first settles the question of whether the presence of Christ in the Eucharist is simply metaphorical, which would mean that the power of the sacrament resides more in the control of recipients and the value which they wish to place on it, or intrinsic in itself, because Jesus is truly present, body and soul, humanity and divinity, in the Eucharist. Now, it's easy to understand why non-Christians especially, and possibly even Christians as well, would have their doubts about the theological claims that Jesus is truly physically present in the Eucharist. Looked at in itself, it seems to be something that no right-thinking, especially scientifically minded person would subscribe to. Who would think up something like this? Now, of all the sacraments in the Church, this is the one to which we find no corresponding similar-like example in other religions. They may have purifying washings analogous to baptism, rites of adult passage such as confirmation, forgiveness rituals such as penance, ordination or election to divine offices, blessings or anointing of the sick, and, of course, marriage. Some even have community meals which are invested with a sacred quality, like the Jewish Passover Seder. But none of them go anywhere near the claim that the divinity they worship actually comes into and intrinsically becomes the sacred meal, which is then consumed by the recipient as its most central act of worship. The second lesson to be drawn, especially from the fact that in some cases, such as Lanciano, the transformation into clearly recognizable human blood and flesh occurred almost immediately after the words of consecration, is that Jesus not only established this sacrament, but a priesthood, an office that would be charged with the task of making it available to the believing community at large. Not just any Christian can speak the words of consecration and expect them to have the transformative force that only those spoken by a priest can have. It has been a long-standing church tradition that goes back to its origins, that only those so ordained have the power to transubstantiate what is at first ordinary bread and wine into the sacred species. Christian denominations which have no Eucharist celebration or an ordained priesthood should question whether they are lacking critical elements that should be an intrinsic part of the Christian spiritual life. It follows, then, that if persons are ordained to this ministry, there must be an unbroken line of individuals who pass this power on from one generation to the next. These persons are identified in the Christian scriptures as episkopoi, which in Greek means overseer, and which we today call bishops. It is to these bishops that are given the overall charge and responsibility for the spread of the gospel and the distribution of church sacraments, the heirs of what is today called apostolic succession. It is easy to understand why in a world where there is so much evil that persons should despair not only of the grace of God, but even of God's very existence. But surely, those who attend to these reports of Eucharistic miracles have at their disposal evidence which attests to not only God's existence, but to the value of church life, especially as expressed in its sacraments. These continue to give us hope and confidence that the designs and plans of God will ultimately prevail and triumph. For viewers wishing further information on Eucharistic miracles, I recommend the following sites. Also, there are the YouTube presentations of Father Mark Goring, who looks into and examines some of the more recent Eucharistic miracles that have occurred in the 20th and 21st century. And then these sites are recommended as well. One dealing with the Shroud of Turin, and the other concerned with the manner used by scientists to determine the blood type of the blood that was part of the miracles.